A measly cook with no future prospects sells his soul to the devil in exchange for 7 wishes. Stanley Moon seeks solace within the walls of the church, asking God for the courage to speak with Margaret Spencer, the waitress that he works with over at the Wimpy restaurant. Unbeknownst to him, a mysterious man named George Spiggott is watching his every move. Later, Stanley works as a cook but remains preoccupied with thoughts on how to confess his feelings to Margaret. As he goes on his day, George discreetly dines in the vicinity, still spying on him. After his shift, he tries speaking with Margaret but ends up withdrawing at the last minute. To make matters worse, she gets into another man's car, which destroys his chances with her. Realizing that his life is dull and pointless, Stanley decides to end it, but the pipe he placed his rope on breaks in his weight, causing a leak. Suddenly, George enters the room, announcing that he's offering £1 million. Without providing further context, he quickly leaves, leading Stanley to follow him and invite him back. George explains that Stanley's long list of great-grandfathers were wealthy. However, his direct grandfather wasted it all away, leaving Stanley penniless and on the brink of ending his life. Offended, Stanley threatens to call the police, but George counters that his previous attempt to kill himself is punishable by law. The man assures him that he wants to help, yet Stanley dismissively asserts that the only assistance he needs is a sock to block the leaking pipe. George gladly takes one from his drawer, which puzzles Stanley as to how he knows where it is. He then redirects the conversation to the £1 million that he previously offered. George claims that it's no bluff and that he can even give him anything that his heart desires because he's the devil himself. Stanley thinks that he's a nut job, so George offers him a trial wish to prove that he isn't lying. He predicts that the man will wish for Margaret, but he says he'll only allow that once he signs the contract. With that in mind, Stanley wishes for a Frobisher and Gleason raspberry-flavored ice lolly. George grants him this, but he doesn't conjure it out of nowhere and merely takes him to a place where it's being sold. Disappointed, Stanley says that only a miracle will convince him, so George snaps his fingers, immediately teleporting them to his headquarters. Stanley is stunned and ultimately confirms the truth when he sees George's name on the building's entrance, indicating that he's licensed to buy and sell spirits. Upon entering the headquarters, Stanley gets shoved back outside by Anger, the guard. However, George reassures the man that Stanley is with him. Later, George reveals that he intends to buy Stanley's soul for 7 wishes. As the man reads the details of the contract, the devil destroys a bunch of packages, claiming that this is his little mischief to upset whoever receives them. Meanwhile, the police investigate Stanley's disappearance. They take Margaret with them since the man wrote his farewell message to her. Despite never interacting with her, all the clues in the house imply that she was the closest person to him, which confuses Margaret and the police. Back at the headquarters, Stanley finally decides to sign the contract. Together with George, they meet up with Sloth, the resident lawyer who oversees the legal work. Despite being half asleep, Sloth manages to be the witness to the document. Soon after, Stanley signs the contract using Sloth's blood. Before granting his desires, George explains that Stanley only needs to blow a raspberry if he wants to free himself from the effects of a wish. If he does it, it will bring him back to George wherever he is in the world. Wanting to be able to communicate with Margaret well, Stanley's first wish is to be articulate. The next day, he arranges a date with her, but he's pretentious with his forced Welsh accent. Despite that, Margaret is impressed and keeps up with his exaggerated energy. Soon after, they end up in Stanley's new apartment, which is filled with scholarly books. They then listen to the German composer Brahms while lying on the carpet. However, their intensifying moment together is cut short when the recorder stops. Just then, Margaret spots a stunning marble ornament, so she goes closer to it and reveals her fondness for tactile experiences. She invites Stanley to join her in a sensory exploration, telling him to touch hard and soft things while subtly intensifying the unsaid feelings between them. However, they soon get awkward, so they stop their little activity. They then enjoy a drink together while Margaret enthusiastically claims that they should break free from social norms and embrace the freedom to connect with others through touch. Misinterpreting her words as an invitation, Stanley pins her to the sofa, which freaks her out. Realizing that he miscalculated things, he blows a raspberry to cancel his wish. This transports him to a tower where George instructs pigeons on who to sully. Stanley complains that his wish was disastrous, making him curious about what Margaret is up to. George immediately whips out his telescope, which also happens to reveal real-time audio. Through the telescope, Stanley observes Margaret in a rowboat with Inspector Clark while they search for his body in the river. Frustrated, Stanley wishes to be a multi-millionaire so he can be a provider to Margaret, who will be his overly physical wife. In a snap, he gets transported to a vast estate, where Margaret is busy playing croquet with her harp teacher named Randolph. She is being the excessively physical wife that she is, but her energy is diverted to another man. Later, Margaret and Randolph flirt by the poolside, while Peter, one of Stanley's business partners who looks a lot like George, insinuates the woman's promiscuity. Worried that he might lose her, Stanley gives her the original Mona Lisa, but she remains unimpressed. Afterward, Stanley engages in a game of pool with Peter and another businessman. Throughout the game, Peter makes the man paranoid about his wife's actions, leading him to check on her and Randolph in the music room. To his dismay, Margaret isn't there, so he returns to his game only to find that Peter has disappeared. He learns from the butler that his wife is in the shower, so Stanley checks on her, only to find Peter accompanying his wife. Overwhelmed, Stanley retracts the wish. He suddenly gets transported to the top of a tree, where George collects wasps into a glass jar. Stanley complains about how bad everything was, and he can't help but be mad at George for the repercussions of his wishes. The devil defends that he's just doing his job. According to him, God thinks that people can only truly be good if they have the free choice between good and evil. Hence, it's George's job to provide the evil. Just then, he releases the wasps toward a group of young folks having a picnic, which annoys Stanley. While the human contemplates his next wish, he accompanies George during his usual mischievous acts. While they're dressed as parking enforcement officers, George manipulates parking meters and issues tickets on random cars. Stanley wonders about the devil's life, so he recounts that he was once an angel, but he got sick of always praising God. He started to wonder what it would be like to be appreciated just like him. However, God saw this as a sin of pride, which resulted in his exile from heaven. After this, the two head to George's house, where he offers his bed to Stanley for the night. However, upon arriving, they find Vanity admiring himself in his room, which leads the devil to scream at the man to leave. Once he's gone, he hands a dress robe to Stanley, suggesting that he wears it to sleep. As Stanley prepares for bed, he contemplates the irony of the devil being the first to show genuine care for him. He expresses his liking for George as a person, but admits his frustration with his mischievous nature. George tucks Stanley into bed, reassuring him that his actions aren't personal. The following day, a captivating woman named Lillian Lust enters Stanley's room carrying a breakfast tray. She then casually takes her clothes off, claiming that she feels constricted in them. After this, she feeds Stanley while being overly sensual. However, before things elevate, George arrives and tells Lillian to leave. Captivated by the woman, Stanley wonders about pursuing Lillian instead of Margaret. However, George breaks it to him that she's married to Sloth. Disappointed yet enlightened by this revelation, Stanley wishes to be desired by women, particularly by Margaret. George proposes becoming a renowned pop star since they're popular with the ladies nowadays. Hyped up, Stanley urges George to make it happen. Soon after, he becomes a famous pop star with Margaret screaming his name. However, he only gets to taste the fleeting taste of stardom as he gets overshadowed by a new band with a vocalist who looks exactly like George. Despite singing in an effortless monotone voice, the crowd goes wild for the new vocalist, especially Margaret. As his song ends, everyone flocks around him, leaving Stanley to retract his wish. This brings him to the top of an electric post, where George pranks people. When asked how his wish went, Stanley replies that it was over before it started. He's beginning to think that the devil is confusing him to lead him to bad decisions, but George only points out that he's learned nothing despite wasting half his wishes. Just then, he tells Stanley that it's time for their next mischievous task, which involves fooling an old woman named Mrs. Wisby. They disguise themselves as eyewash salesmen, and despite not being a consumer, George convinces Mrs. Wisby to buy 10 bottles. This way, he'll make it seem like she's a loyal customer, and thus she'll have a chance to win a silver tea service and a night out with with Alfred Hitchcock. Excited, the older woman agrees and sets off on her bike to make the purchase. Right after, George barges into her house and helps himself with her food. He stress eats since all his successes are short-lived because God intervenes with his might and power. Sometimes George works so long on making a client evil, only to catch him repenting before he dies, thus allowing him into heaven. Just then, Wisby returns with 10 bottles of the said eye wash, excited to answer the question to win her prize. George then pops the question, asking her how tall the Duke of Edinburgh is. She comes close to the correct answer but ultimately fails. With this, George takes 10 pounds from her savings jar and quickly leaves with Stanley. When they get outside, George suddenly tells Stanley that Margaret is dead. However, he soon reveals this to be a prank, which pisses Stanley off but somehow makes him long to know what Margaret is up to. He suddenly says that he wishes to be a fly on the wall where he can observe her. To his surprise, George takes this as a wish and transforms both of them into flies in a wall of a morgue. There, Margaret continues to help the police in the search for Stanley. However, Clark becomes too suggestive around her. As Margaret inspects if one of the corpses is Stanley, she can't help but talk about how seemingly special he was. However, Clark thinks it's a shame that he took the cowardly way out. Infuriated with this accusation, Stanley decides to attack Clark but finds that his insect body is hard to maneuver. Stanley decides to avenge him and bothers Clark, so he urges Margaret to leave with him and attend a party with his friends. As they exit, he sprays insecticide in the room, forcing Stanley and George to transform back into humans. Encouraged by hearing that Margaret thinks he was special, Stanley wishes for her to fall in love with him. However, George presents an alternative idea. He advises Stanley to envision a life where both he and Margaret are passionately in love, living in the countryside with 2 lovely children. Stanley gets transported into this reality but soon realizes that Margaret is married to another man who looks like George. Stanley is having an affair with her, and just as they attempt to fornicate, they are quickly consumed by guilt. Unable to stand this emotional agony, Margaret breaks up with Stanley, leaving him no choice but to end the wish. Stanley soon finds himself submerged underwater alongside George, who is creating a ventilation hole in an oil tanker. After emerging from the water, George reveals that he's near the end of his pact with God. The two are competing to collect 100 billion souls, with him receiving double the count for every soul God obtains. With only 6 more souls needed to win, George expresses his aspirations to return to heaven and take his place at God's right hand as his favored angel. Suddenly, Stanley confesses to George that he no longer wants to use the rest of his wishes because the devil always finds a way to twist them. Not wanting to upset him, George invites him to spend a fun afternoon with him and 2 other women, Avarice and Gluttony. They promptly visit a theme park, where everyone except for Stanley seems to be having a great time. On the ride home, George admits that he can't help but find loopholes in his wishes, given that it's his nature. He advises Stanley to be more specific with his wishes to avoid this. While he thinks, George offers Stanley to rest in his room, allowing him time to reflect on whether he wants to proceed with his endeavors. However, Stanley finds Envy in the room, who harbors resentment towards George for neglecting him. Envy discreetly advises Stanley to include God in his next wish since he's the only one who can overpower the devil. Stanley consults George for his next wish, expressing his longing for a reciprocated love with Margaret. He envisions living in the countryside, devoid of any other romantic interests for Margaret. Stanley also desires for both of them to have warm and loving personalities. Impressed by the clarity of Stanley's request, George fulfills his wish. However, George turns him into Sister Luna, a nun of the Order of Saint Beryl who swore a vow of silence. He attempts to retract the wish immediately, but it doesn't work. This makes him stuck with the other nuns, who worship by jumping on trampolines under the watchful eye of the big sister, who resembles George. Margaret is also among the nuns, harboring a deep love for Stanley despite their uncanny situation. However, Margaret refuses to be in a relationship with him because they're both women in this circumstance. With this, Stanley heads to the headquarters on foot to meet with George. Anger refuses to let him in, but he beats him up and forcefully enters. Stanley immediately reminds George that he still has one more wish, but he soon finds that the ice lolly was actually his first wish, which leaves him with nothing more. Realizing that he's stuck in a woman's body for the rest of his life, Stanley sadly attends George's farewell party later that night since he's won his competition with God. As George dresses in preparation for his ascension, Stanley expresses how much he wants his old life back. Hearing this, George decides to be generous and return his soul, as he exceeded his quota of 100 billion souls. Handing him the contract, he instructs Stanley to simply burn it, assuring him that everything will revert to its former state. After this, George makes his way up to heaven. He gets greeted by Saint Peter, but he acts rudely around him, thinking that he'll be God's favorite again. However, as soon as George boasts about returning Stanley's soul, God rejects him and leaves. George is puzzled, so Saint Peter explains that his kindness towards Stanley was driven by the wrong motives. He only did it to feel good about himself, which disappointed God. In an attempt to revoke this, George descends back to Earth and tries to stop Stanley from burning his contract so he can return it to him with the right motives. However, Stanley refuses to be fooled again, so he locks himself in the room and burns the contract, despite hearing George banging on the door. This brings him back to his old life, wherein he's a cook at Wimpy's with Margaret being the waitress. There, he musters his courage to ask her to dinner, but Margaret asks him to reschedule as she has prior plans. Despite this, the man is pleased with himself. George appears beside him, offering to help, but Stanley declines as he has found the courage to handle things independently. Hearing this, God chuckles from above, recognizing that a mere mortal has outwitted the devil.
Subscribe to watch more videos like this, turn on notifications and leave a like to help the channel out. Thank you for watching.